what has been the journey that banks and the State Bank of Pakistan have gone through together? And in particular, I want to just recap for everybody all the wonderful work done by banks with the support and the guidance from the State Bank, especially during COVID. I think it's important to look back because to me that is a big achievement of the banking industry of Pakistan. The second thing I want to cover is what does the State Bank see as the challenges going forward? And I'll be brief because Salim Raza Saab has already addressed those very well and very comprehensively, so he saved the time that I might have to spend on that. And last, I want to very, very quickly talk a little bit about the outlook for the economy of Pakistan, because the future of banking is intimately connected with what we see as the outlook for the country. So let me start first with the role played by banks during COVID. And I am really happy, really delighted when I look back and I see what all of you did during COVID. You know, it's easy to forget now where we were about a year and a half ago. But when COVID struck Pakistan, there were, of course, issues of lives and livelihood, but there were also very, very basic issues about how people would be able to access banking services. And the great global lockdown that occurred and the lockdowns that occurred initially in Pakistan as well really posed us unprecedented challenges. And I want to mention something about that phase. And what I want to mention is because of all the efforts of all the bankers, led by their CEOs, by their presidents, and because of all the efforts by some of the officials of the State Bank of Pakistan, many of whom are seated on this table right in front of you, I think we were able to maintain, first of all, banking services for Pakistanis. And I just want to tell you, if at that point banks had not been able to maintain those banking services to the customers, that would have really accentuated the sense of panic that existed at that time. So ladies and gentlemen, I want to first and foremost applaud all of you, all the bankers and all my colleagues at the State Bank who led us through this very, very difficult period. I do also want to remind very quickly of that journey. And that journey started with the State Bank of Pakistan reducing interest rates very quickly from 13.25% to about 7% just in the span of two and a half months. It was one of the sharpest, one of the fastest reductions in interest rates. But to me, when I look back on that journey, what makes it quite revealing and a learning experience and interesting for me is not just what we did by way of reducing interest rates, but it is all the other measures that we took together with the bank that I think is what separates Pakistan's experience from other countries. And I do want to point out some of those new measures that were undertaken, that were implemented by all of you who are sitting here around the tables. In aggregate, when we look back, the State Bank of Pakistan, working through the banks, injected about 2 trillion rupees worth of liquidity into the system. And that happened in a very quick time frame, and it was critically important because our whole goal was that if we are quick to inject liquidity into the system over and above what we do through interest rates, then we will minimize those instances for businesses as well as for households where liquidity problems might turn into solvency problems. So this 2 trillion rupees worth of liquidity that was injected, which is about 5% of GDP, was absolutely critical at that time to save jobs and in turn to save lives. Some of the key flagship schemes that were introduced, one was the principal deferment scheme. Another was an incentive for banks to restructure loans. By incentives, I mean incentives that we give from a regulatory perspective and the classification and the provisioning that would have to happen. Another scheme, another first, was the Rozgar scheme, the Rozgar scheme or the payroll financing scheme was something never tried before. And it was a scheme designed specifically to protect jobs, where the State Bank lent to commercial banks and asked them to on-lend to those customers who committed to those banks that they would only lend if the customer committed to not laying off any workers in 6 months. And I just want to point out also that when we rolled out these schemes, what is particularly rewarding is to see that the distribution of the benefits reached both the small, the medium players, as well as some of the larger players as well. And I want to illustrate that. In the scheme for the payroll financing, 238 billion rupees were disbursed by banks. And out of these 238 billion rupees, there were about 2,700 businesses that received this financing. Out of those 2,700 businesses, 2,000 of those were either SMEs or small corporates, and by small corporates I mean corporates with a turnover of less than 2 billion rupees. So that scheme not only saved jobs, but I'm happy that in its distribution it also was fairly evenly distributed. Another first was a scheme called TERF, the Temporary Economic Refinance Facility. This is a scheme under which 435 billion rupees were approved, and to date about 215 billion rupees have been disbursed. This was a scheme that was also, while it was developed at the State Bank of Pakistan, very much benefited from input from banks. And I remember at that point we had very, very frequent interactions with the bank presidents, and some of the refinements and improvements that came in this scheme came from suggestions from the bank presidents, from their conversations with their own clients, such as extending the scheme to balancing and to modernization, as well as for new projects, how it was conceived originally. In this scheme, about 50% of the beneficiaries of TERF were beneficiaries with loans amount of 500 million or less. In other words, I wanted to point out that in the distribution of TERF as well, there were a number of beneficiaries that also were medium-sized players. Another key point I want to make is that many times it is said that the benefits of certain schemes that either the State Bank or the Government of Pakistan comes out with are limited to certain sectors, and often textile sectors is mentioned one that gets a lot of the benefits.
पाकिस्तान बैंकिंग अवार्ड 2021 की तकरीब से खिताब कर रहे थे गवर्नर स्टेट बैंक रजा बाकिर। उनका कहना था कि कोरोना वबा की वजह से दीगर मुल्कों की तरह पाकिस्तान की मईशत को भी मसाइल का सामना करना पड़ा। कोरोना वबा के दौरान बैंकों ने जो किरदार अदा किया है उसको सराहते हैं।